We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Marlene Trestman. I'm a bio board member, Biographers International Organization, and member of the workshop committee, along with Ann Boyd-Rue and Steve Paul, who are bringing you this workshop this evening on the biography of science, medicine, and innovation. I think you'll find it really fascinating. We have three terrific science biographers for you this evening who have combined written about the lives of 7 scientists, physicians, and a nurse and inventors. And before we get onto that, I want to just say a couple words about Biographers International Organization. If you aren't already, we sure hope you'll join our organization. It is dedicated to supporting the art and craft of biography and supporting the writers who do that. We've got a wonderful website filled with information and tips and the latest news in the world of biography, so be sure to check it out. You'll also find links there to past programs that are filled with information, well-received programs on everything from fair use and first-time biography writing, research, promotions, marketing, and other topics. So check those out. And those, as well as this program in a week or two, you can find them all on Bio's YouTube channel. So be sure to let others know about that. The other thing I want to tell you about is Biographers International Organization offers many benefits. Not only is it the sole biographers organization that awards its own prize to best biography, a prize awarded by biographers, but Biographers International Organization also funds fellowships for various types of biographical writing, if that's of interest to you. And we have our upcoming conference, which will be our 11th conference. And this time, for the first time, it will be all virtual. It will be May 14th through Friday, May 14th through May 16th. And it features in just one of the many great opportunities, a conversation between David Blight and Annette Gordon-Reed, and lots of panels on all sorts of great topics. And if you're a bio member, you get to register at half price. So check that out on our website. It is one-stop shopping for everything you could need about the art and craft of biography. So the only other housekeeping is you're on mute now. And if for some reason you come out of mute, please mute yourself. As we proceed, feel free to post comments or questions in the chat function. A number of you have submitted some great questions in advance, and we're going to do our best to work those into our conversation as we can. But please feel free to comment, and you know, it's one of the nice features about Zoom that you get to participate along the way. So to turn to the program tonight, the biography of science, medicine, and innovation. I'll make just 3 brief introductions. You can read more about our panelists on our website, and their websites are all linked as well. First, we have Rayvon Fouché, Professor of American Studies in the School of Interdisciplinary Studies at Purdue University. We have Charlotte D. Jacobs, MD, Professor of Medicine at Stanford University and a proud bio member, and Catherine Reef, who has authored more than 40 young adult books, many of them biographies. So we're going to start off tonight. I'm going to let each of our panelists read just a brief excerpt of their choosing to set the stage, and also to tell us a little bit about how they came to choose their subject. And in my very weak attempt to show my knowledge of science, the reason I've picked the order we're going to go in is because that's where their letters fell on the periodic table. And so first, representing carbon, we have Charlotte, number 6. Charlotte, take it away.
Thank you very much, Marlene, and welcome, fellow biographers. So when I was a child, the carefree atmosphere summer was always dampened with the threat of poliomyelitis. Newsreels at the movie theater, newspapers, magazines showed repeated photos of children using crutches or entombed in iron lungs. And so on April 12th, 1955, when a waiting world learned that Salk's polio vaccine could prevent polio, he became the hero of my generation. Well, over the years, I began to wonder what happened to Jonas Salk. After reaching such acclaim at age 40, what did he do for an encore? His life seemed a little bit strewn with controversy. Why was that? I found no formal biography to inform me, so I set out to write one. So I thought, since this is a science discussion, that I would just read the very first time that I introduce poliomyelitis to the audience. The illness started innocently enough, a sore throat, a runny nose. At the end of the day, the child spiked a fever, became restless. Then the pains began, electric shocks that darted through the back, legs, neck, and shoulders. Muscles twitched and spasms twisted him into a peculiar posture. All night long, the child thrashed about in his bed, drenched in sweat. His face became pallid. When the fever broke, he appeared to be recovering, a deceitful interlude as polio virus left the bloodstream and invaded the nervous system. Within a day or two, paralysis struck as abruptly as the fever had, and no one could predict the nature of its onslaught. A weak leg, which improved in a few days, or an arm dangling, useless forever. Poliomyelitis impaired motor control of either one muscle or a group of muscles. 3/4 of those afflicted survived, many condemned to life in a wheelchair, on crutches, or in bed. They joined a generation of cripples.
Thank you, Charlotte. That was terrific. And next on our periodic table in order is Catherine, representing calcium.
Calcium, I knew it would be calcium. Hi, everyone. I tend to write more about people working in the arts, and I have an interest in women's lives, and so I write about women in history. But I do have biographies, and an early one of mine was on Sigmund Freud, and more recently Florence Nightingale. And for these two books, Marlene reached out to me and invited me to be part of this program. I chose Freud as a subject because at the time my son was a student in high school, and I noticed that some of his friends had a very strong interest in psychology. And that got me thinking along those lines and what might be, or who might be a good subject for me. And I settled on Freud, although his ideas tend to have fallen out of favor. He was very influential in the pioneering of the study of the workings of the mind, and so much of his ideas and his terminology remain relevant in our culture. So I thought really to have a good basic understanding of psychology, it's important to know about Freud and his contributions. Florence Nightingale, I came to through my interests in history and women's lives. My editor and I had success with our book on the Bronte sisters, and I thought I'd like to return to Victorian England and spend a little more time there. And searching for a subject, I found that there are many books on Florence Nightingale for young children, but there was not much at all for the young adult age group. And I thought that this was a good opportunity. And I'm going to read from that book, from Florence Nightingale, The Courageous Life of the Legendary Nurse. And we'll focus on another disease. In the early 1850s, Florence Nightingale was superintendent of a hospital for indigent gentlewomen. Nightingale left her post in August 1854, just as cholera was showing up in a crowded section of London. This killer disease came on suddenly. A person might feel fine one day and be overcome by severe vomiting and watery diarrhea the next. The person's eyes looked sunken and the skin grew gray, loose, and clammy. Other signs of dehydration were more ominous: a weak, rapid pulse, a struggle to breathe, and seizures. Death often followed quickly. Cholera sent its victim to the vast abyss of eternity, to the presence of his maker, almost before he's recovered from the first surprise of his attack, as one doctor dramatically put it. Before long, this outbreak grew into the worst one London had yet seen. 127 people died in the first 3 days of September. A week later, the death toll had reached 500. How is the cholera generated? How spread? These questions are in every mouth, stated an article in a London medical journal. One moment, warm, palpitating human organisms. The next, a sort of galvanized corpses with icy breath, stopped pulse, and blood congealed, blue, shriveled up, convulsed. The cause of cholera will probably ever remain among the inscrutable secrets of nature, this writer concluded. It belonged to a class of questions radically inaccessible to the human intelligence. Doctors and scientists had come up with theories to explain cholera. According to the animalcular theory, microscopic insects invaded the body, causing disease. Some experts preferred the fungoid theory, which attributed cholera to an unknown fungus. There was also a telluric theory, which blamed a poison rising from the earth, and an electric theory, which pointed to fluctuations of the atmospheric electricity. Additionally, the ozonic theory stated that cholera arose when there was too little ozone in the atmosphere. Many people, including Florence Nightingale, accepted the miasma theory to explain disease. They believed that foul air released by rotting vegetable matter, dead animals, or decomposing corpses caused people to get sick. This deadly air or miasma could even arise from stagnant water. The poison may be wafted east and west, north and south, on the winds of heaven, on the garments of the passerby, warned Dr. Edward T. Rowe of the Board of Health of Plymouth, England. The best way to keep people well and help the sick recover was through sanitation, Rowe and others taught. They called for better ventilation to bring fresh air in the place of the deadly poison passing from the bodies of the dying.
Thank you, Catherine. And Ray, representing radium at 88, tell us something a little more illuminating.
Hopefully I will.
For inventors.
Yes, so I guess I'll begin how I ended up writing about 3 African-American inventors of the late 19th, early 20th century. And my pathway, I think, is decidedly different than Charlotte and Catherine's. Mine began as a graduate student in a graduate program where I was in a history of technology seminar. And I was looking for a project to write on and was thinking about different ideas. And we had traveled down to New York City to have brunch with the woman I was dating at the moment. And her grandmother, with her grandparents, and her grandmother gave me this article from the New York Amsterdam News about Black inventors, because she knew I was getting a PhD in science, technology, something or other. So, and that wonderful, generous thing people do, I looked at this list of inventors, names, and patent numbers, and it didn't really add up to me. There seemed to be some mistakes, things that didn't seem particularly clear. So I began studying and looking into these African-American inventors as a seminar paper. It grew into my dissertation, and it became my first book on African-American inventors in technology. So I can talk more broadly about the ways that experience materialized, but that's the broad strokes. So the section I'm going to read is from the chapter I wrote on Granville T. Woods. Granville T. Woods is still one of the most prolific African-American inventors, received the most patents out of still any African-American. But what made him interesting is that he was involved with, I would say, all the shady people in the invention and patent business. And what made him interesting was that he was very skillful at hustling all parts, the left, right, up, down, and in between. And oftentimes he would get in a little fixes, as I'll call them. And most of the information I was able to uncover about him comes from the patent records, and particularly interference case files, which were legal cases that are judged in the patent office. Over 3,000 pages of legal testimony related to his patents. So he would get into it a little bit. So I'm going to read a section from, this is October 1891, when he's dealing with some of his work, and one of his, he does have an arch nemesis, and his arch nemesis is called a person named James Zerby, and they spent 15 years battling out in the patent office. So on Saturday, Woods came into the American Engineering Company office to show the model to prospective investors. He brought with him the drawings sealed in their tube. During the time he was explaining the work of the model, however, Zerby and his son Arthur came to the office and noticed the mysterious tube on Arthur's desk. Not having any idea what the tube contained, the senior Zerby opened it and found 4 sheets of the drawings from the invention that he'd been pressing Woods to sign to the company. The Zerbys quickly scurried away with the drawings and copied them. That evening, Bowen, Diebold, and Keim met at Zerby's house to certify the tracings. When Woods realized his drawings were missing, he had a fairly good idea who had them. Zerby returned the drawings on Sunday when Woods was not at the office, and according to Woods, this is what took place on Monday morning when Zerby arrived. And this is Woods' legal testimony from the patent, the series of patent interferences. This is Woods, quote, he says, "He came into the office and went directly to his desk. I followed him there. I accused him of taking the drawings. He had once admitted to the theft and stated that he was much obliged to me for leaving the drawings where he could take them and copy them. Thereupon, I called him a thief and some other names and told him he was unworthy of the name man. He said nothing until I started out of the office, and then he struck me in the back of the head. Instantly, I responded. When Zerby fell, I ran around the table, and just as he was getting up, his son Arthur, who at the time was quite large for his age, ran in and leaped on my back, wrapped his arm around my neck, and used every effort to choke me. The road made such a noise at the stage that one of the janitors in the building ran in from the hall to separate us. There was no more conversation between us at that time. Zerby only made one remark as follows: I will get even with you yet. So I like that section because oftentimes we think about invention and patenting as this very above board business where people are just sharing intellectual ideas. But actually, it's the 1890s. It's a little rough and tumble, and people are literally fighting over their ideas and the opportunity to own these ideas.
That's great. Thank you. That I think is a perfect segue to a question. How did you manage to balance for each of you the personal lives with the science lives of each of your subjects? And Catherine, you want to go first?
Well, I always keep in mind that it is a biography, it's a life story. And so I'm making an effort to understand this individual and present the person as fully as I can to my reader. But the work, whether it's science or it's work in the arts, that's the reason the person merited the biography. So that needs to be part of the book as well. And for young readers, this could be their first encounter with the individual. So I do need to explain it. And I always, I think, or for the most part, work chronologically. And as the work comes into the story of the life, I'll discuss it there. And I think whatever the age of the reader, the author, you have to think, well, what might they already know or not know? And what do they need to understand to be able to follow the story of Florence Nightingale or whomever? So that kind of guides me with how much to say, how much depth to go into at each point along the story, but it is first and foremost the life story.
Charlotte, how did you balance the professional versus the scientific, the personal life of Jonas Salk or Kaplan?
Yeah, so I'll talk about Salk because they were both a little different. And that is that, well, I started out with all his achievements and had this lengthy outline because he didn't just do the polio vaccine. He was a co-developer of the influenza vaccine. He came up with an immune therapy for multiple sclerosis, a cancer therapy. And in fact, he was starting the first trial on an AIDS vaccine when he died at the age of 80. So that was pretty easy. But as Catherine alludes to, the life is not a chronicle of events. We have to find that vital spark. What's the intellectual, the spiritual, the moral concept of the makeup of the person? How does it evolve with time? And so that was hard for Jonas Salk because he was an intensely private person. He had this kind of protective shield that he put down. It made it very hard to comprehend the paradoxes and some of the questions in his life. So I often felt like I came into my study and there was this huge pile of clay sitting on my desk, and that my task was to sculpt the perfect likeness of Jonas Salk. And so I used to call it Seeking Salk. And there were quite a number of ways that I would do that. Of course, he had enormous archives. I spent years going through them at UC San Diego. But besides all the science aspect, there were all these wonderful little nuggets in there because his secretary kept a copy of every letter he sent to anyone. And so Jonas Salk had this, always responded to the public. He wrote notes. So for example, a woman wrote to him and said that she thought cats were the cause of polio and had like this 5-page letter. And he wrote back and thanked her and said, that was very kind of you to do that. And I certainly will take that under consideration. That was the kind of aspect of Jonas Salk that no one would have kind of known. I looked at almost every video interview that he ever did. And to see him change over life, it was really, really quite amazing. I did over 100 interviews. That was probably the most help, starting with all of his family members, his second wife, Françoise Gillot, the artist who's kind of known as Picasso's mistress, his people that he worked with, the reporters who followed him around. And so I got this kind of enormous variety of anecdotes, but I always felt like people were holding back just a little bit because they didn't want to tarnish his image. And so it took a lot to kind of get underneath that to really discover the man. Then I had two things, and then I'll stop, that I had to be very careful of, which anyone will with kind of a science hero. And that is, in my veneration for him, I had to make sure that I didn't write a praise book. And secondly, because he lived in the limelight, as again, many of your characters will, I kind of had to get beyond the iconic image and try to find the man. And I heard this adage at one of the bio conferences, and I love it. I actually have it above my writing desk. Get beyond the legend without destroying the man. And that was my goal with Jonas Salk.
Wonderful. And another benefit of Biographers International organization.
Oh my gosh, yes. And I'll bring that up later because I feel strongly about it.
Ray, you had 3 people to deal with. How did you balance personal life versus scientific and invention prowess?
Well, I think I came at it a different way. And I think one of the central questions I was asking of these 3 individuals was, what was it like to be a Black inventor in the late 19th or early 20th century? So arguably the project was really looking at the technical work, but also how they existed and lived within late 19th, early 20th century American society. And part of it had to do with the social cultural moment. And particularly, right, late 19th, early 20th century, invention was seen as this God-given ability. So you were born with it. You couldn't get it any other way besides, divine power. So Black inventors were a really powerful tool in thinking about undoing racial perceptions of Black inferiority. So their personal lives were deeply connected to who they were as individuals. So their relationships also bled across those many different barriers and borders, right? I think all of the people we were writing about is that they just didn't go into their kind of scientific technological space. The relationships led outside of that world. So they talked with congressmen, officials, and in pulling my research together, you had to find a lot of their personal connections that shed lots of interesting light on who they were as individuals. So part of it was just trying to understand who they were as human beings and what motivated them to begin and do creative and innovative work. And I think for me, it was balancing the two. Is that part of what made that interesting is that they're kind of messy, interesting individuals, and the creative technological work or the inventiveness was oftentimes potentially not central to who they were at the moment. So part of the idea I was working with is that traditionally the idea is that someone invents and that is their main vocation. Only one of the people I was studying, that was their primary job. So what does it mean for someone to invent on the side, desire to have something patented and try to commercialize that object while they have a full-time job, they're doing all these other things and trying to survive the racial world of the late 19th, early 20th century. So part of it was just not even trying to separate them or balance them, just what the goal was as I mentioned, is, similar to what I think Catherine said, try to tell three-dimensional stories of these inventors' lives. And the three people I wrote about, two of them have huge myth and mythology centered around them. So part of that was trying to open up their lives to a more thoughtful, more three-dimensional reading of their existence.
Thank you. And let's continue on that point, that is sort of busting myths and I guess, or telling warts and all. Ray, talk a little bit more about what that meant for you and give us a little more background about what the myths were about your three inventors.
Well, so I'll begin with Lewis Latimer. And the myth and mythology around him was that, well, and depending who you ask, still is, that he was the Black man who invented the incandescent light bulb, and Thomas Edison stole that idea from him and patented it. And so that narrative gets replayed over and over again. So part of that is to figure out what actually he was doing. And in my research, what I found, I think, was way more interesting than what had happened. What ends up happening is Latimer begins his career as a draftsman, and he's super amazingly skilled. So he works for the legal firm that submits the patent for the telephone and a host of other really important patents. And he's also working for electric company, the competitor to the Edison companies. And he spends time in Montreal, in Scotland. He travels all around the world. But part of his life is dealing with all the second and third and fourth tier hustlers and operators. So about a month before Edison patents go into years of legal battle, they hire Latimer into the legal department. It's a group of 6 people. And pretty much his job is to use his tacit knowledge and experience to go to battle for Edison patents and tell people, no, actually, this guy did this work, he can be dismissed. So he's a key internal consultant. So in many ways, the reason why we think of Edison as the inventor of the light bulb has to do greatly to Latimer's personal and individual knowledge. But part of what is the struggle is that some people don't want to hear those stories. And I think when we're having the conversation about biography, a lot of folks want to hear the celebratory heroic narrative, but people are really complicated. And one of the pieces that people don't like to hear about Latimer is Latimer was, I would say, a hardcore assimilationist, meaning that his friends were folks like William Ferris, who they would talk about Black people need to become Negro Saxons. And so there are moments where that narrative has gotten me into trouble, in a sense. People have been very upset with me for devaluing the heroic individual. Some people like the heroes, and there are moments where it has been difficult to tell people, well, I'm actually just trying to give this person's life. It's just analysis, but sometimes people don't want to hear that. So I think that's the big struggle is that, so how do you manage to tell a story that's reflective and representative of their life? And so the one piece that made me feel really great about it was Lewis Latimer's granddaughter, who passed away about a decade ago, was really generous and really helpful with the project. And I remember one of the last times I saw her, I was taking her back to her apartment in New York City, and I asked her, it's like, Miss Norman, have you read my book? And she's like, you know, sweetie, no, I haven't. So I was like, well, let me tell you what I wrote. And so I explained it and kind of detailed, and she said, well, yeah, that was pretty much him. And so I feel like I got her stamp of approval on that, and I had to move forward. So I'll stop there and let others speak.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Ray. Catherine, did you have to disclose some warts and all?
I did with Florence Nightingale. In fact, a friend of mine calls my book Florence Nightingale, Warts and All. And it's because when the British government sent her to the Crimean war zone to, head nursing in the hospitals and bring female nurses, it was something altogether new. And the public, the idea of a lady going and doing this kind of work was just foreign to people's thinking, so that there was really a PR campaign in the press that, oh, she's a normal, devout, very feminine lady and altruistic and so on. So this image of her persisted, and much of it was true. She was very selfless and giving, but she was not always what we would call a nice person. And this was something that tended not to be brought out, particularly in books written for young people. She remained the lady with the lamp, and that was the image at home. The pictures of her were published, carrying the lamp, going from one soldier's bed to the other, and faultless. But the Crimean War was just 2 years of her life. She came home and continued to work to further public health in the army and in India, all kinds of things. And she would have people who were devoted to her. She was ill. She got sick when she was there in the war zone, and with a disease called brucellosis, a bacterial illness that she never got rid of because there were no antibiotics. So she worked pretty much from her bed. And she had people who would be very devoted helpers to her, but she just drove these people mercilessly to the point that a couple of them ruined their own health. But she felt that what she wanted to get done was important and overrode everything else.
And Charlotte, was it tough for you to pierce the icon and legend of Jonas Salk? You talked a little bit about that, but what about the difficulty? Was it a challenge?
Well, so I'm going to do a warts and all as opposed to a myth, because there were lots of myths. But he certainly was seen as a hero, a saint-like man. I mean, he was it. He was mentioned in the same terms with Gandhi and whatnot. So I had done tons of interviews, and I was now into my AIDS period, and I was interviewing John Cohen. And John is a very well-published journalist who followed the AIDS saga. And we'd spent hours interviewing, and at the end of it, he said, "Okay, Charlotte, so what are you going to do about Jonas's skirt chasing?" I went, "What? What are you talking about? I've interviewed 100 people. I've read every article in the newspaper about him. Nobody mentions skirt chasing." So one lead led to another. And in fact, there were quite a number of women and extramarital affairs in his life. The women often knew of the other women. They all had 4 characteristics in common. They were young, they were beautiful, they were highly intelligent, and they were very accomplished. So what was I going to do with that? Really? So at that time, around that time, I was at a bio conference, and I went to a panel with Debbie Applegate and Nigel Hamilton, and it was on writing about sex and love.
I was there.
Were you there? It was a great panel. And they made the point that, yes, you have to include all of that in one's book because it's part of the tapestry of life, not just some salacious sidebar. Okay, I thought, and his sons were very controlling, by the way, over the whole biography. They wanted control over everything. And I thought, okay, now, really, am I going to put this in his biography? But I decided I had to. But if I was going to, I really had to understand, what did this mean about Jonas Salk? Was he just a womanizer? Or was he an innocent bystander? And a lot of women, just because he was famous, wanted to attach their names to him. What was going on? And I tried to kind of seek that from a number of people. And interestingly, his son, his youngest son of 3, who never acknowledged that there were other women in his father's life, said to me at one point that his father had this large unmet need to connect with others on a very intimate level. And he never knew how. And so he spent his entire life trying to search for that perfect relationship that would kind of make him feel whole. And so I figured in the end, I did have to include it. It just pointed out that he was human. It just pointed out he was human. And in fact, I love this one quote from one of the women who said, Jonas said to her, "I discovered early on that everybody puts his pants on one leg at a time." I thought that said it all. So I did put it in the biography, and about 6 months later, when I was giving a talk at the Salk Institute, one of his sons came up and said, "You know, I knew you'd find out someday, but you did a pretty good job explaining it." So.
Ray, did you have more to add on that?
No. I mean, I think it's just, I think both Catherine and Charlotte did a great job of saying that it's a tapestry of life. So just because people are work in this technical, scientific, or medical space doesn't mean they don't live outside of that world as well. And sometimes that part of their lives is just as interesting as the technical work. So, you know, one of the people I was studying, I wrote about Shelby Davidson. A lot of his invention had to do with working in government service. And when government service became segregated and he lost his job, due to kind of the racial tension of the moment, that impacted his desire to invent. So it's directly connected to who he was as an individual. So it's impossible in my mind to extract the scientific technical work from the human.
All right, well, let's get to some more nitty gritty. Tell me, do you have to be an inventor to write about an inventor? Or Charlotte, you're a doctor, you were writing about a physician scientist. Catherine, you had challenges, I assume, in getting to know the work of Sigmund Freud and Florence Nightingale. Let's start with you, Catherine. What was the biggest challenge in writing from your professional and educational background about your scientific subjects?
I think it has to be Freudian psychology, because there's so much terminology, so many concepts and ideas. Freud was a very prolific writer. And there was a lot I had to define. You know, for my audience, I couldn't assume they know the meaning of ego and id in these various terms. They have to be defined. So there is a glossary, but I do briefly define them within the text. But I kept in mind three questions, really. What were his most significant ideas? What books did he write and what were they about? And how did he apply his ideas and methods with his patients? And for the most part, I inserted this information chronologically, but I did begin the book in Freud's office, where he's beginning an analysis with the patient. And the account comes from his own case histories, because it just gives the readers an idea of what this is that they're going to be reading. And it's kind of fun. You know, he says, say whatever goes through your mind. And it invites you to imagine, well, what would I say if I were lying on the famous couch? And he said, you know, imagine you're a passenger in a train looking out the window, and you just tell me, you know, your thoughts as if it's one thing after another that you see, no particular order. I just like that way in. So I did begin with some of that, and then, you know, go back into his childhood, and the other information pretty much came into the text as it happened in his life.
And let me just ask you about the glossary, which is a great device, of course, that supplements the reader without bogging it down. You were writing for a young adult audience. How technical was your glossary?
Not overly technical. It's pretty much basic definitions. What you need to know to be able to understand the story of Sigmund Freud. Thanks.
Charlotte, what didn't you know? What was hard for you, given your background as a physician and teacher, to write about Jonas Salk? Oh, you're on mute.
In pursuing a career in academic medicine, I had to learn very quickly early on the style of scientific writing that's used for journals and textbooks. And that's not very conducive to communicating with the general public. So actually, it wasn't until mid-career that I decided I wanted to write a biography. I always loved biographies, but I decided I wanted to write a biography. And as you can imagine, having an MD by your name is pretty much a liability, not necessarily an advantage, except that you know the diseases. In fact, I love this quote. I've always loved this quote from Norm Cousins. He said, "Physicians and writers regard each other with mutual fascination and distrust." So during my sabbatical year, I began studying creative writing and then focusing on biography writing at Stanford University, with really actually a master of creative writing named Ehud Havazelet. And I got to study with him. I continued to study with him for 10 years. And in fact, I've never stopped studying biography writing, ever. And I do have to put in, again, a plug for Biographers International, because they are like a continuing education course that's going on all the time in my life. So the big challenge for me was actually writing in an accessible way. So I always felt that Ehud, unfortunately, he died at a young age from leukemia, but I always felt throughout my life, writing life, that he's been sitting here right on my shoulder. And the reason is because anytime that I kind of defaulted to medical jargon, which is the easiest thing to do, he'd react like I scraped my fingernail down a blackboard, you know, that horrible feeling. And so I just wanted to give you kind of an example. And this was when I was talking about how polio affects the brain. And I had written down this. Bulbar involvement occurs in 5 to 35% of patients, producing dysphagia, dysarthria, and difficulty handling secretions. Respiratory insufficiency often occurs. Woo! That wouldn't pass. I could hear Aya going, no. So it took me actually weeks to write this description instead. If the polio virus attacked the nervous system higher up in the base of brain, death soon followed. Paralyzed throat muscles impeded the victim's swallowing. A sip of water streamed out his nose or drained into his windpipe, causing the youngster to sputter and cough. Unable to swallow saliva, he foamed at the mouth. Breathing gave way to gurgling. As his mother wiped the bloody froth from his lips, he gasped for air, drowning in his own secretions. The struggle over, his eyes rolled back, a few muscle jerks, and the mother hailed her lifeless child. So,
okay, so for
that's
the
my challenge.
for the $60,000 question here, how'd you get from before to after?
A lot of work. Actually, Ehud taught me, used to make me do this exercise that I hated, but it was worthwhile, I think. He would make me write a letter to someone like Uncle Nate, who's a lawyer. And tell Uncle Nate about immunotherapy for multiple sclerosis. And so I would write something that was, again, more acceptable and understandable to someone who was not in the medical profession. So.
That's a great tip. So Ray, do you have to be an inventor to write about 3 inventors and understand the fascinating world of patents?
No, but I think some of the biggest pieces I had to overcome were understanding the technical world of the late 19th, early 20th century, as well as the patent world. So I'm very familiar with post-1930s, 40s technical jargon. I do have a technical background, so that made it simple. But a lot of the things that I was looking at and studying, from the diagrams to the drawings to the writing, it's a lot of technology that is taken for granted now. So things you'd never learned about. So I had to learn how to be, in a sense, a late 19th century electrical engineer or a person of that ilk. And the same thing with the patent process. So I jokingly tell people, if you need to patent something in 1905, I'm your guy. But the contemporary moment, I have no idea what to do. So part of that is just you have to be knowledgeable and conversant of what's going on, because part of it is just understanding how to follow the pathway. And part of that is that a lot of the material I was working from come from the National Archives and the patent record. And if you didn't understand how the patent process worked, the documents would not make sense. So part of that is that, there are these things called patent wrappers. And most of the patent wrappers, I was probably the first person to open them, since they were put in the box 100 years ago. And so you have to understand how the patent office is functioning, how they're documenting events, how they're recording the process, and just being able to follow the pathway. So understanding that was really important. But I would say that part of the dynamic, you have to understand the technical work, at least for the inventors, to understand what they're trying to accomplish and the difficulties they're coming up against. You have to understand what they're trying to do. So part of that was really becoming conversant with a late 19th century engineering and science technology of that moment.
And I'm just curious, in that world of patents, did you gain your understanding intrinsically or organically by what you were seeing, or did you have to resort to other historic textbooks or outside sources to understand what you were looking at? Does that make sense?
Yes. So, and a lot of it was just organically, because at the time, right, there weren't very many law schools. Legal training was done more indirectly, and a patent attorney, there's a whole kind of layer. There are people called patent solicitors who would help you make it to the patent office. So that idea of a patent attorney in the way we think about it nowadays didn't exist. So part of that was just trying to figure out who actually was doing the work and how that information moved forward. So, you know, there are bits and pieces to understanding the patent office, but primarily it was just going through the patent wrappers and following the pathway and going, okay, that's how this process is working. And just spending a lot of time with old patents and old patent documents to understand how the patent office works. So unfortunately, I wish there were these compendiums of information about this is how you patent in 1895, but there may be, but I didn't find them. So I had to kind of learn on the fly. Similarly, like a lot of patent attorneys at the time were learning on the fly.
Thanks. Well, Catherine, you probably faced the same thing, and this was one of our viewers' questions, how to get into the historical context of the particular scientific or nursing events of Florence Nightingale, or in the psychology world with Freud. Did you learn it organically, or did you resort to secondary sources or outside areas, outside sources?
I try to use primary sources as much as I can for historical material, particularly. I do a lot of work at the Library of Congress. I live near, well, now I can't, it's closed, but I spend a good amount of time there and going back to original sources. And I think particularly for Florence Nightingale, it's more of a historical account rather than, she was not a scientist, she was a nurse, but the science is important to the story. So it's more from a historical point of view. And she wrote quite a bit, as did, Freud wrote, Florence Nightingale wrote and published quite a bit as well. So we have her accounts.
But for you to understand, or for the reader to understand the importance of her use of statistics, how did you go about making sure there was a historical context of how significant it was given the knowledge at the time?
Well, Florence Nightingale is considered a pioneer in the use of statistics. In her reports that she did after she came home from the Korean War, I keep saying Korean, I don't know why, Crimean War, the reports she was doing for the government, pie charts and lists of statistics and all. And this was something altogether new, and it helped people understand the points that she was trying to make. It just made it all very, very clear. So I didn't really have to learn about statistics. In this case, I was just saying she did this.
Got it. And Charlotte, in terms of, did you have particular difficulties in understanding the historical context of where medicine was at the time? You talked a little bit about, what you had to go through, but any other challenges in terms of putting it in the context of not what we know today about the diseases, but what it was at the time? You're on mute.
One of the things I could kick myself is I used to skip the classes on history of medicine when I was in medical school. And so that was bad. But no, I loved going back and learning the history and figuring out how it contributed along the way to all of the diseases, because there were multiple diseases that Salk was engaged in. And in Henry Kaplan, it was the whole history of the entire history of cancer and cancer medicine. So I found that very interesting, but I had to stand back and keep saying, who's your audience? Who is your audience? In fact, I used to pretend like I was writing the book. My husband reminded me, my first biography, he said, remember you said you were writing it for Margaret, the neighbor, who was a smart woman, housewife who liked to read good books. Remember that. And so I think that was one aspect. The other is the challenge, and I think someone brought this up in a question that was posted, was where do you bring in the history? Do you flash back? Do you move forward? How do you get all that backstory in? And one of the things that I've done throughout my writing, I'm sure everybody does, but is I read so many biographies, but I don't just read them, I study them. And so all my biographies are all marked up. And one of them in this case was, how did they do the transition to get back to the historical background in terms of a disease and then move forward? And so that's one of my suggestions to the newer biographers who are on this workshop, is study those biographies, find ones that have the similar issues as yours, and go through and learn. You can just learn from the biographies themselves.
Did you face, each of you, actually, let's take one of the questions that came in from the chat. How did you manage dealing with families of your people? How did you parse a sense of obligation to them and telling a difficult truth? Ray, you've already touched on that. Was there more you wanted to share on that topic?
No, I think that's it, because all the other folks that I studied, their families, like Granville Wood, he was a single bachelor and passed away anonymously. Shelby Davidson's had 2 daughters. They didn't have any children. So these are people that just sort of disappeared. And Latimer was the only person I knew. And thankfully, his granddaughter was really generous with me. She was just excited that someone was trying to have a more scholarly, robust analysis of him. So she had written a children's book about him, but she wanted something better. And she said she was not interested in doing that. And she was really, really wonderful to me in that regard. And, you know, I heard Charlotte said that Salk's children were very controlling. She was just very generous. She would connect me with anyone who I asked her who had any information. But in the same token, as I mentioned before, she didn't read the book either. She was just happy that someone was doing something about it. So I'm curious to what Charlotte and Catherine have to say, because I didn't really have to deal with families.
No, you didn't have to deal with it, but you did talk about receiving criticism. Was it from just individuals in the public sphere, or did you face actual historical or scientific criticism for mucking with their legends? No,
it was more the public. I think, you know, I feel like the book has stood the test of time pretty well from a historical and technical perspective. But there are folks who didn't like the criticism of heroes. And I'll give one example. So Lewis Latimer, his house was called the Latimer House. It was a house in Flushing. And at the time, it was becoming part of the New York City public parks business. Similarly, in that moment, there was the book was written about in the patent section of the New York Times, and I kind of lay it out. However, the Latimer committee was very upset with me, because at that time in the New York public park business, you needed a kind of clean, unadulterated, heroic figure to kind of move through smoothly and seamlessly through this political process. And I didn't give them a clean, smooth, heroic figure. And, you know, I didn't write my biography to make it harder for the Latimer House to get certified in New York City. That was not the goal. But just the timing of that comes at different moments. So part of it is that understanding that even though I'm trying to tell a more three-dimensional, more historically accurate version of their lives, it potentially has collateral effects that I don't know about.
Just curious, did they get their certification?
They did.
Very good. You can rest easy on that.
Yes.
So Catherine, I realize that Florence Nightingale is a historic figure and likely didn't have any descendants for you to deal with, and you can tell me if I'm wrong there, but were there particular groups or other people with a vested interest that you had to be concerned with?
No, I really wouldn't say that, but to go back a little and talk about family. Family was very important in Florence Nightingale's story because her family was a huge obstacle to her pursuing her goals in nursing. When she was a young woman, she believed she had a calling from God to pursue nursing. And this was at a time when women of the upper middle class, to which the Nightingales belonged, had a very, society and her family had a very strict view of what life should be for a young woman like this, that she was expected to marry, to focus her attention on home and family. Education beyond a certain level for a woman was considered a detriment rather than an asset. And nursing at the time, it was not a profession. This was something that women did who maybe had failed as servants or had a problem with alcohol or were involved in sex work, and hospitals were dirty, dangerous places to be that people of means avoided. So when Florence announced to her family that she wanted to become a nurse, it just created chaos in the family, and she adopted a philosophy which I just think was wonderful. She was going to study secretly at night because she was able to get government reports and so on medical issues. And she said she was going to be like the moon orbiting the earth, that only one side, on Earth we see only one side of the moon. Her family would see only one side of Florence, and she would have this secret life where she studied. So, you know, dealing with her family was a big part of the story. But in biography and with young people, I say that, you know, no one lives an easy life without any obstacles. And part of the value of reading biography is seeing how did this person respond to, you know, whatever blocked his or her way in life. And, you know, what can we learn from this that maybe we can apply in our own lives when we face difficulties of our own. And in Florence Nightingale's case, it's really determination, never giving up, and she was able to succeed.
Thanks, Catherine. Charlotte, I have a feeling you had to deal with some living family members.
Yeah, so I had different kind of situations with both of my biographies. In the case of the Salk biography, he has 3 sons, all 3 are physicians. His archives are at UC San Diego, but at the time were under lock and key, and that you had to get permission from the sons in order to go into the archives, and you had to tell them exactly what you were going to be looking at. Not only that, unbeknownst to me, I flew down there once and they said, oh, you can't come into the archives now because you have to reapply every time that you want to work in the archive. So although 2 of the sons were very happy to interview with me and perpetuate the kind of the image of their father, and were very, very nice and helpful, and one son didn't really want anything to do with it, but there was that enormous control. But finally, I remember after several years, I was done. I'd actually read his entire archives, and I came out and I said to the head archivist, yay, you know, I did it, I'm done. And she said, well, I hate to tell you this, I'm not supposed to tell you this, but actually there's a lot of stuff in the vault. I said, what are you talking about? Well, it turns out that there was a lot of stuff that they did not allow to even be accessioned into the archives that you could apply to use. And what was in there that I had been looking for, and no one seemed to be able to tell me where they were, was he kept, from the time he was an adult, he kept night notes. Essentially, he had a diary. Oh my gosh, how could I not get that? Well, it turned out with a lot of kind of sleuthing, and many of the women in his life, actually, he had given parts of his diary to read, and they all generously sent me copies of it. And then I could see the personal demons that the family was kind of hiding. But I have to say, again, at the this is where I learn everything, is at the bio conferences. There was one, there have been several on dealing with difficult families. I was chasing Kelly around multiple times, asking Kitty, I'm just sure they're going to sue me, and she gave me all kinds of tips because, of course, she dealt with some of the most difficult families. My other biography was a very different situation. Henry Kaplan was this, kind of wear his heart on his sleeve, bombastic. Everybody knew what he felt about everything. And his wife was delightful and told me wonderful stories and was so helpful. But he had a colleague, his colleague that worked with him all those years. They had some real personal difficulties, which played out sometimes in clinic with patients there and at conferences. And his name was Saul Rosenberg, and he's a medical oncologist. And so when I would try to interview him, he'd say, well, that doesn't have anything to do with the science. Just kind of stick to the science. And he kept that going several times. And in fact, he tried to get me to drop the project. And he's just several years into it. He said, it's going to ruin your career. Well, it just so happened that he was my boss and I was coming up for promotion. So it made it but I was determined. And so it made for a very awkward situation. So neither biographies were easy in that regard.
Let's talk about a practical topic of interest to our viewers, and that is tips for publishing a book, a science biography. Who wants to go? Particular challenges you overcame, tips on framing it, and Catherine, perhaps in particular in the young adult market, any tips for publishing about scientists, mathematicians, doctors, nurses?
Well, it is a very hot topic right now with the STEM fields, and particularly if you have a woman, a female subject, or diversity is another issue that's very important in young people's literature now. My books, I worked with the same editor and publisher for a very long time, so I'm not the best person to ask about finding a publisher or a new market. But I did see a question earlier, someone who's had some difficulty placing a manuscript and that an agent wasn't willing to take it on, or a number of agents. And I might suggest, not every publisher requires you to have an agent, every children's publisher. Educational publishers that publish primarily to the school and library market often produce books in series, and an agent may not be so interested in placing your book with this kind of a publisher because they don't pay a lot, but it's a way to get a foot in the door and get started. So doing a little research yourself and finding these publishers and approaching them might be a thing to do.
Well, that's great advice. Thanks, Catherine. Ray, any particular tips or lessons learned in getting a publisher, either for your biographical work or your many books since then on science?
I can talk more generically about the academic market. So all of the books that I've published have been university presses. And I think, like most things, it's about building relationships with editors and acquisition editors. So I think part of it is just talking to people, because from our perspective, right, at university presses, acquisition editors, part of their business is to acquire books that they believe will sell, and they have responsibilities as well. And I think from my experience, most acquisition editors are pretty straightforward with saying, yes, this is something we're interested in, or no, this is not really fitting our book portfolio. So I think mainly it is just to talk with people, and I I know we live in the digital world, but I'm very much of a kind of phone conversation person, meaning that it's way easier to explain the intricacies of your project if you can talk to someone for 5 minutes than to break out a lot of text, which just doesn't make any sense. And part of that is that some publishers have been really, really great because you have to understand it's a network. They know each other. They know who is acquiring books in this specific area. So if they're not interested in your book or project, you can ask them, do you know anyone else who might be interested in this project? And they may not, or they may know someone else who at another press who might need to find a book in a specific area. So I think partly it's about building relationships, talking to acquisition editors. And I like the idea of getting people on the phone or in Zoom and having a conversation with them, because it's easier. I find it's way easier to sell a project to someone in different contexts. So I find my perspective, the advice I've given like graduate students that I've worked with about promoting their projects, I tell them, don't try to have a conversation about your project at a conference or some other small setting. Ask them, can I talk with you next week when you're at home in your office, and let me pitch my project in a more complete way? Because I think more people are willing to give you more time instead of standing out in the lobby of some conference arena or some other place. I think it gives you an opportunity to practice your pitch and understand what it is. And I think part of it is like making it is selling a project, right? So what makes your project more interesting, more desirable to a press? Part of it is how do you sell the project and make it meaningful and interesting to others, right? It's because at the end of the day, right, I live in the academic world, but the press also wants to have the book sell. So if I can't convince them why my book would be useful or meaningful to course enrollments or just the general population, then I'm in a bad place. So I think the quintessential elevator pitch is really great, but you've got to be able to fill out the rest of the picture of the project.
Thank you. And Charlotte, any particular challenges or more importantly, lessons learned in selling science biographies?
Well, I didn't think it was particularly related to whether it was science or not. I think it's the whole issue of selling a biography. Again, I think it's still available. Well, nobody's mentioned the agent. I mean, the main way to get your book published is to have a good agent who can sell it to a publisher. And that's becoming seemingly more and more difficult. And there is I don't know, Marlene, if it's still up on YouTube. 3 agents did a workshop and gave some really very, very good advice. So
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I mean, some agents may be a little more comfortable with a science topic, but when it comes down to it, this is a biography, the biography first. And so I think that's important. The other is that a lot of science people aren't like household names. And the whole issue of hidden figures, whether they're really hidden or whether they're just not known to the public, that's a big thing. I mean, you have to make even a stronger case for them to take on your biography. The other is, before you start searching, have that query letter and have your knockout proposal. That is torture. I find writing a proposal torture. It's one of the things I hate most about writing. And there's some wonderful books on proposal writing and some people that are real kind of experts on it. But that's the way to get it published. Good query letter, great proposal, pick out an agent who really believes in you and who gets to publishers who will like your book. So nothing specific for science.
That's okay. That works too. Couple other questions we got. One is, can you recommend any great research resources beyond the obvious Google Scholar? What things can non-academics get to that you would recommend that we not forget about, or that we should know about in science?
Well, PubMed is is available to people, and that is a great source. Although most of that is, of course, written for the academic world. I had two possibilities. One, nothing like the public library to to first get going, and so I pretended like I wanted to learn about astronomy, and I know nothing about astronomy, that I was going to write about it. So I just looked in our public library this week online and found, oh, look, there's an astronomer's guide. If you're new to it or simply want a slim, straightforward book by a physicist at Princeton University, it's a no-nonsense, cleanly written, non-technical account. So don't forget about the public library. The second is one of the things that I do is I go to let's say I want to write a book on a mathematician. Oh, well, let me go and see what Sylvia Nasser has in her selected bibliography. Oh my goodness, there she's got the man of mathematics. She's got a century of mathematics in America. So again, you can learn so much from everybody else's biography. So if you're writing on a mathematician, you know, go look and see what all the mathematics, or you're writing on physics, go look at the Einstein biography and find out what were his major sources that he used. Pretty simple.
Ray, any tips in terms of the non-academics trying to get behind the scenes and dig in deep on a subject of science? And you're on mute.
Yes, I would say, as I mentioned before, I'm a people kind of person. So archivist, first, second, and third. So part of what has been always the wonderful experience I have had at archives is that you think you know it's there, but you have no idea until you have that conversation. They go, well, have you looked at this? And you're like, I have no idea what you're talking about. And those are the moments where you think you have it all together and you are having this conversation with one person and you are the only person that sparked that little idea in that archivist's head. So, I mean, some places for technical work that are really great is the National Museum of American History, the Smithsonian. So the National Museum of American History was initially the History of Technology Museum. It got changed. So the museum and the buildings, from curators to archivists are chock full of really amazingly wonderful, generous, smart people that do work on history of science and technology and have a breadth of knowledge that is incredibly amazing. So for instance, also the Library of Congress just hired its first History of Science and Technology manuscript division person who's an archivist, Josh Levy. So there are places and spaces where the folks are really useful. And so they produce these documents that are search guides for what the archives is and contains, but oftentimes that search guide just scratched the surface. And getting to actually have a conversation with the archivist and saying, I'm looking for these specific things. What do you have there that's useful and meaningful? And it's really incredible. So, I mean, just even some of the work I do on technology and sports began by having a conversation with the archivist at the National Museum of American History, showing me this whole series of artwork on bicycles. So you don't know what those conversations will lead to. So I really think it's important to really ask the archivist in places and spaces where you think the documents would be are really, really helpful.
Terrific, thank you. And say what Josh Levy's title is again?
He is the History of Science and Technology archivist at the Library of Congress. I know Josh because he was a graduate student that I taught in a seminar about 15 years ago. He just emailed me and said, "Hey Ray, I got this new job this summer."
Well,
So
we'll tell him you sent us.
yes, he's looking for people to talk to. And then, as he mentioned before, he asked me, "Did you know that the Library of Congress had a history of science and technology division?" I said, "No." So they've got some work to do, and that's part of getting the word out.
Anybody have an answer for this questioner? Any tips for grants, fellowships, or funding sources for science biographies? Anybody have an answer for that?
I had a couple of suggestions. One there, which I think is fabulous, the Sloan Fellowship at the Leon Levy Center for Biography in New York. That's just incredible. I mean, what a nice tip of the hat to science biography. And then you can look at, I mean, some of the artist residence programs, for example, the Jurassic, which is a fabulous resident artist program, has a special residency that they call Scientific Delirium Madness to explore the creativity of scientists. And so a lot of artist residencies obviously are highly competitive. Jurassic is among the most competitive, I think. But here they again are recognizing the kind of specialness of science and science writing. And so, you know, I'm sure if you can search and find almost anything on the internet these days. But those are just two thoughts I have.
Ray or Catherine, any thoughts on that?
No, I don't.
I can add one place where you would not expect to look is the National Science Foundation. So the National Science Foundation, one of the directorates is called Social, Behavior, and Economic Sciences. And within the directorate, they have a program called Science and Society. I think it might be called Science and Technology Studies now. And they support independent scholars within this program. And grant limits, I think, are between $100 up to $150,000. They're very competitive, but you'll have your proposal reviewed by a group of sympathetic folks who do work on the social and cultural implications of science technology. So that's one place that you should look.
Terrific suggestion. All right, so what are you all working on these days? Anybody have anything in the hopper they want to talk about? Charlotte, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm not writing about science per se. I have a book with that I'm almost finished the first draft called One Unprecedented Second. And it's the story of Setsuko Nakamura Thurlow, who at the age 13 survived the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and vowed that she would spend her life making sure that that never happened again. She went on to accept the Nobel Peace Prize in 2017, and she is felt to be the driver behind the landmark UN treaty on the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which was made nuclear weapons illegal when it came into force about a month ago. So she's and she happens to still be alive and very active. And so that's my project.
Excellent, terrific. We'll look forward to seeing that. Catherine or Ray?
Well, I'm not working on for a number of reasons, I'm not working on a biography right now. A big reason is something that kind of surprised me, that I've been responding to the events of the past year, you know, what we've all experienced. And then for myself, I suffered a profound loss in February of 2020, but I started writing poetry and I'm enjoying it immensely. And it's challenging and satisfying, and I'm really concentrating on that right now.
Oh, that's wonderful, terrific. Ray, what do you working on?
And again, I'm not working on a biography at the moment. So it's a project that's rethinking Afrofuturism and trying to pull back Afrofuturism scholarship and work from focusing so much on the planetary and the celestial scale to thinking about the planetary implications of Afrofuturism. So it's structured around a lot of Black intellectuals in the 1960s, from Mary Baraka, Martin Luther King Jr., Ishmael Reed, and their writings on science and technology.
Terrific, wonderful. So we have time for some last thoughts and tips on either science biography, or you have the floor to talk about writing with other interested folks. Who wants to go first? Charlotte, you have some last thoughts for the evening? You're on mute.
I always felt like I called myself the lonely biographer for many, many years, because even though I was at a great university, Stanford University, I didn't feel like I had any colleagues or anyone that wanted to talk about biography writing or who I could relate to at all. And I have to say, for any of you who have not joined Biographers International, and I'm not being paid for this advertisement, but it really opened up my life as a biographer. I felt like suddenly, I remember I went to the very first meeting and I went, oh my gosh, there's Debbie Applegate, and there's Linda Lavelle, and there's Nigel Hamilton. Oh my, all the greats are here. But then they would actually talk to you.
I'm laughing because I can see Linda at the top of my.
Oh my gosh, oh hi Linda. And so it's so wonderful to have colleagues particularly in writing, which is it can be a lonely profession. So, and the price is right. I mean, it's based on what you earn from your writing. So that if you aren't earning much as a writer now, you don't have to pay a lot to join it, but it's really fantastic. And so that's my tip for today.
Oh, that's terrific. Ray?
But my tip is, don't write by yourself. Meaning that, I find writing really hard. It's really difficult to marshal those words one behind another in a coherent, meaningful, useful way. And part of it, what makes it work for me, is having a supportive, collaborative group of people to write with, that you can say, you know, I'm going to send you something. I haven't proofread it. It's kind of a mess, but can you let me know that I'm going in the right direction? Or do you think this sounds okay? And those people who will read and go, yeah, I know the punctuation, the grammar, it's a mess, but this looks like it's going to be something. You need those people that are cheerleaders for your work, no matter how bad it is. And you know, I have two people that I hold on dearly from graduate school that I'm going to say, I'm going to send you this. It's a disaster, but let me know. And I think oftentimes people spend way too much time saying, I'm only going to share when it's near perfect or beautiful or cleaned up and organized and together. But sometimes you need someone to say, you're going in the right direction, or it's a mess because it's a mess. And maybe you should rethink that.
Thanks, Ray. Catherine, you have the last word.
All right. I guess what I'll just say for the last word is, one thing that I love about writing is there's always something more to learn. There's always an opportunity to grow as a writer. It's not a field where you can say, well, I'm at the pinnacle now, I know everything, and I'll just coast, because there's always an opportunity to expand and become a better writer.
That's perfect. What a great way to end the evening. Thanks, Ray. Thanks, Charlotte. Thanks, Catherine. And also to Michael Gately, if I hadn't mentioned before, our executive director extraordinaire, who made sure that the Zoom train ran on time tonight. So thanks, everybody. And please do register for the Bio Conference. It's going to be terrific. They always are. Charlotte is absolutely right. And we'll have to send her a t-shirt or something for all that good stuff she did. So good night, everybody. And thanks a lot. Stay well.
Thank you, Marlene.
Thank you.